Good afternoon, everyone. To just say that at this Sixth Form College, one of the things that we value is respect. Okay, so we respect all political viewpoints and persuasions. So, to my immediate right is a character that you know already, Tom Lord, who is the candidate for Oldham East and South Wales. And then James is going to talk for about 20 minutes about why he believes we need a Conservative government in this country. And then we're going to move on to questions from the floor, and I've got some here with me.
Some of you might actually remember me from last Friday, and if you did vote for me, because I think I came second in my overall. Thanks very much for that. What was said already about respect, you'll recall last Friday that we were all very, very conscious about that, about setting a good example for you, and that was something that I stressed as being very important. And I hope that last Friday you thought that we were respectful to each other, even though there were differences in views and opinions, and that you got a lot out of that, and that it helped to inform you. I think a lot of you are going to be voting for the first time this time, aren't you? Is that right? Yeah. Okay, certainly today, you'll have heard some persuasive arguments for the reasons why you should be voting Conservative. That's something that obviously I emphasised last Friday, and clearly I'm going to stand by today. So thanks very much again for coming.
So what I wanted to talk to you about, and I won't try and take up the full 20 minutes, because I want to give as much time as possible for you to ask me questions. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is why I'm a Conservative, what first got me involved in politics, a little bit about where politics is at the moment, where we're going, and I will put in a sales pitch for you voting Conservative, because after all, that is what you do during a general election. So the first big event, political event, that I can really remember was the Winter of Discontent. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, how many of you have studied it. It was late 1970s. British economy was doing incredibly badly, quite frankly. We had a whole load of public sector strikes. The International Monetary Fund, which is the lending bank to the world, was called in to bail out the British economy. This is an organisation that normally lends money to developing nations that are in financial trouble because of mismanagement or poor government. One of the other things that I saw through the 80s, much less positively, was a big change in the British economy. So when I was a kid, heavy industry, shipbuilding, steel industry, mining, were really important parts of the UK economy. By the 80s and 90s, they had very much declined, as had a lot of manufacturing, and that hit certain parts of the country really hard. And I think, looking back, one of the errors of politics at the time was not understanding what was lost when those industries went into decline. And I think we are living now with some of the consequences of that economic change. That was definitely about our relationship with Europe. It was also about our internal relationship within the UK. And young tended to vote Remain. And in the smaller cities and towns, older people and non-graduates tended to vote for Leave. And what that showed us is that there is a big group of people who don't feel the current economy is working for them. Knocking on doors and listening to people, many of whom have never voted Conservative before, who feel that the people who have represented them for a long while, and in much of the country that's Labour, have not been listening to them. As a Conservative Party, I think we've been really bad at explaining to people why it is in your personal interest, but also in the national interest, to vote Conservative. One of the people who I work with on a daily basis, Munira Mirza, was a student here back in early 90s. Munira Mirza worked with Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London as one of his key advisors, and as Prime Minister, she was in fact his senior policy advisor, and was instrumental in the Conservative Party manifesto. And that manifesto will set the political agenda, hopefully, for the next 5 to 10 years. And that is what increasing choice and freedom is all about. Not telling you how to live your life, but giving you opportunity to live the life the way you want. And that basically means freedoms, so giving you the freedom to live your life, but also the resources to live your life the way you want to. You want to make sure the economy keeps growing, so there are good quality jobs for you, for your family, for your friends, but also that the laws don't constrain you and hamper you and hold you back. And that really, at a philosophical level, is the big Conservative offer. If you think of anything else you want to discuss, I am more than happy to.
It's about what James has told us. So before we get on to the questions, does anyone want to say anything about what James has said? Yeah, gentleman at the back.
Before you mentioned how Conservatives are trying to give more freedom to people, right? Within the Conservative manifesto, they mentioned how they want to try and revoke the Communications Act of 2003, or the Online Communications Act. What is your opinion of that?
So online communications is a really difficult subject. And there is a balance. So, naturally, all my inclinations are towards freedom of speech and towards making sure that people, as I say, have choice. But I'm also very conscious that at the moment, the digital communication space is a bit of a Wild West. And that is one of these challenges between a philosophical starting point, which is, give everyone as much freedom as possible, which is my instinct, maximising choice and freedom for all, but recognising that also comes with responsibilities. We have seen some really appalling lies and distortions sloshing around the internet. And if that's all that it was, if it was just words and it had no implications, had no knock-on effect, yeah, maybe I could live with that. But actually, there are some individuals, some groups who have been very aggressively and specifically targeted by lies and misinformation online, and they do need to be protected. So we are going to tighten that up, particularly around online victimisation, online abuse, because we do need to make sure that, as I say, whilst we are protecting freedom of speech, we don't allow people to be vilified and victimised online, because if you're not comfortable with it in the physical space, then I don't think we should tolerate it necessarily in the digital space.
In the manifesto it says that you'll be increasing 50,000 nurses to the UK.
Yep.
And it's been found that 19,000 of those already exist, so therefore it would be only 31,000 increase. So is that misleading the public?
It's caused a lot of confusion, and if we could have communicated it better, then maybe we should have done that. So currently there are about 280,000 nurses. We're going to make that figure 330,000 nurses. Yeah, and we're going to do that in a number of ways. At the moment, too many qualified and experienced nurses leave the profession. So we want to reduce the number that leave, and that's where the 19,000 comes from. So there's 19,000 that we want to keep in nursing who might otherwise have left. We're going to recruit some nurses from overseas, and our immigration policy is going to adapt so that we can do that. We're going to persuade some qualified nurses who have left the profession to come back into the profession, and we're also going to train up some new nurses. So there are the 4 different ways we're going to get those numbers up. Now, that added together is going to be, that's how we're going to get to the 330,000 nurses. And that's 50,000 more than what we've currently got at the moment.
If there are 3 words that might be remembered in this general election, it's get Brexit done. This seems to be a mantra that we've heard a lot of. So I suppose what I'm not clear about is what that actually means, because my understanding is we're being promised the withdrawal agreement by the 31st of January, but that doesn't get Brexit done, does it?
There are a whole load of things that we think of as Brexit and European stuff, because for the last 40 years they have been tied up with our relationship with Europe. So, for example, our immigration policy has largely been defined by our membership of the EU. Our trade policy has largely been defined by our membership of the EU. Our internal investment policy, in terms of what sectors or businesses we support financially or legislatively, has largely been defined by our membership of the EU. fishing, agricultural policy, all that kind of stuff. On the 31st of January, if we have a majority Conservative government, we will have left the European Union with the withdrawal agreement that the Prime Minister has negotiated with the EU. At that point, we will have left the EU. Our legal status will be that we are no longer a member of the EU. That is Brexit. Britain's exit from the EU. After that, there will be other things that will still need to be negotiated. So we will need to have a domestic immigration policy. We will define our own trade policy, both with the EU and with other trading blocs and countries around the world. Our state aid policy, our etc., etc. All these policies are things that most countries do all the time anyway. They debate and change their trade policy, immigration policy, etc., etc. We think of them as Brexit things because they've been tied up with Brexit. But our exit date will have been the 31st of January. The big thing that people are worried about is our future trade relationship with the EU. And a lot of people are saying, oh, you can't possibly negotiate that in a year. Well, the people who are saying that are largely the same people who are saying to the Prime Minister, you can't renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, you can't take the backstop out of the withdrawal agreement, there's no point in trying. And he nailed that after 2 years of delay, he nailed that in 90 days.
The question is, why are your policies focused on reintroducing things your party took away?
Yeah. So some of the big things that we're focusing on is getting police numbers back up. We spoke about nurse numbers, investment in the NHS and that kind of stuff. And the point you're making is that, for the period of time we've been in government, we have seen some of those numbers of public service professionals come down. The simple truth is, when we stepped into government in 2010, the national finances were in a really, really bad way. And I spoke about the 1970s when I was a kid, and the IMF being called in. That was under a Labour government. And it was a Labour government that were trying to spend money on public services. They were good people trying to do the right thing, but they just did it badly. And when we stepped into government, the economy was badly broken. And it's taken us the best part of 10 years to get it rebalanced again. And in that 10 years, it's meant we've had to make some difficult and unpopular choices to keep the economy stable. Now the economy's in a better place, unemployment's at a record low, wages are growing faster than inflation, we've got overseas investment coming in. That then gives us the flexibility financially to do what we want to do.
Years I've prioritised the economy at the expense of people. So we've had an increase in food banks, we do a lot of college to support them. I volunteer at a bed for every night. 10 years ago, those things didn't exist. And I would just like to know the Conservative Party kind of attitude towards people and social conscience.
And it's salaries, and it's about money going into public services, and it's about making sure that we can recruit and retain public sector professionals. So the economy is people, and people is the economy, and then they're not separate. And I think sometimes the language we use doesn't properly reflect that, and I think that is an absolutely legitimate criticism. And I could go through the various things about food bank use, for example. One of the reasons why we get a lot more food bank use now than we did previously is that we changed the law so that local councils can refer people to food banks. I mean, prior to that, the local government was not allowed to refer people to food banks. We still have fewer food banks per capita than, say, Germany, for example. So I would love it if food banks never needed to exist. Of course. So that family having to go to a food bank is a really painful personal story, and it's an experience I would wish no one had to rely upon. But the best way of doing that is to make sure that people in that family have got a job, that it's a well-paid job, and it's supported. So that personal, difficulty that family have got, the solution to that is a stable economy.
Language is action, and we've had 9 years where actions could have happened to reduce but I'm lucky not having a...
So now here's I've got to say, here's the thing again. The reason that it's taken us 9 years to rebalance the economy is because there are decisions that we could have made about reducing public spending to get the income and expenditure balanced done quicker. As a government, we could have made those decisions. But those decisions, if we had reduced public spending, or actually we never really reduced public spending. I mean, the growth in public spending slowed down. But if we'd cut public spending, for example, that would have hurt the very people that I got into politics to protect. It would have balanced the economy quicker, but there would have been a human cost to that. And the decisions that we made in government was to not be as aggressive in rebalancing the economy as we might have done. That's meant that it's taken longer, but luckily we maintained employment through most of that time. We weren't seeing people, going into mortgage arrears in big numbers. I mean, in the late 80s, when I saw, the downturn, the recession in the late 80s, there were people handing back the keys to their houses because they couldn't pay their mortgages. There were businesses going under, and thankfully we didn't see that this time round. Now, it's meant that the pain has been, for a lot of people the pain has been longer, but it's not been as abrupt. And that is a really difficult balance. But ultimately, if you have a broken economy, you can't help the people that I got into politics to help.
Right, thank you.
Like today, you're saying a tax cut was after 100 days
Yeah.
for Brexit, so I'm not sure how
Yeah. So one of the big things, I don't want to get too heavy into public finance economics, but there is a. You familiar with the Laffer curve? I mean, anyone familiar with the Laffer curve? Some of you will be, some of you won't be. There's a taxation sweet spot. So, for example, if I were to say to you, I'm going to tax you at 100%. So every single penny you earn, I'm going to take in tax. How much work would you do?
No.
Exactly, because what's the point? Okay. So at 100% tax rate, my tax income is zero because no one's doing anything. If I were to say I'm going to tax you at 0%, so I'm not going to take a penny off you in tax, how much tax would I generate? Zero again. So at 0% tax and 100% tax, my tax take is zero. And there's a kind of sweet spot which maximizes my tax take. Yeah? And if you start increasing taxes, you get what we saw in the 1970s. You get companies moving overseas. You have people moving overseas and taking their incomes with them. And when I was a kid, we had an upper rate tax band in the 90s, 90%. And nobody paid it. Because anyone that was in that band just moved. And they just took their money with them. And that was part of the reason why we broke the economy. So actually what we saw, this tax is corporation tax. When we reduced the rate of corporation tax, we got more money. We generated more tax revenue because there were more companies doing more business.
Got no pension. If I don't work, I don't earn. And there is a perception, unfortunately, that the Conservative Party is this callous, unfeeling body that has no conception or regard for how people actually live. Well, it's not true. James said there, in respect of this sweet spot of taxation, it's something that I've thought about as well, because I'm thinking, well, let's assume I don't get elected and I go back to doing what I'm doing. I want to help people, that's why I'm standing. Let's assume I end up going back to doing my day job. And all of a sudden there's a Labour government. And a Labour government, if I'm fortunate enough to reach that upper echelon of taxation where they're proposing 70-80% of taxation, where's the motivation and incentive for me to work above that threshold? Now I've got a responsibility as a taxpayer to everybody, for public services, for hospitals. I'm not turning a blind eye to that. I've got a responsibility as someone who works in this country to everybody else, people who are suffering, people who need assistance. But if we get to the point where it's counterproductive for me to work because you're taking away all that extra money, where does that leave me? Where's the incentive? Where's the ambition? And what I would do with that additional money is put it back into the economy. I'd be spending it. I'd be spending it in shops, in small businesses, in pumping it round. So there is a sweet spot. That's part of the reason why I'm a Conservative and why I'd be urging you to vote Conservative.
There's a massive row, very technical row, which we can't get into today, about the definition of poverty between absolute poverty and relative poverty. So relative poverty, which is the figure that's usually used, is families earning less than 60% of the median income. And what you find is, as some people in society get better paid jobs, that people who weren't defined as in poverty suddenly get defined as in poverty because other people have had a pay rise. Now, you know, that spread of the better paid and the less paid, that matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it's entirely possible that your family could have had a pay rise, but because someone else had a bigger pay rise, you're now defined as being in poverty, even though you had more money than you had yesterday.
Reinforcing this idea around money, but 120,000 people have died in poverty. Can you not understand that like separate to money, and like money is one thing, but lives are literally going
Now,
Conservative.
Challenges that we have got is that you can never measure what has happened against what the alternative would have been. And again, there is a huge amount of disagreement about those figures and about the reason about whether those figures are accurate and the reason behind those people that have died. And I'm not in the position to contest them. But the broader point is that if you're measuring that, you've got to measure it against something, and you've got to measure it against what might otherwise have happened. And I've seen, when I was growing up, when I was a bit younger than you, under a Labour government, people in council, social workers, NHS professionals, housing professionals get laid off. And, you know, we inherited a really difficult situation in 2010.